Welcome to today's episode. We're so lucky to have on today's guest, Ben Rabner. He's the Vice President of Demand and Growth Marketing at Sensor Tower, an adjunct professor at the Marriott School of Business, and a good friend. Welcome on, Ben. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Dallas. Excited for our conversation here. I missed the chats that we had in class and all the really thought-provoking questions that you'd offer up. So anytime we get to catch up again and talk more about some of these things, I'm excited.
Yeah, thanks again so much. I love that class. And I think for those who might not know about that experience design class that you teach, it's just once a year. I think it's kind of relevant to the topics that we're going to dive into today, but what other kind of topics do you dive into in that class? Like, what are you passionate about as far as design goes? And then we'll kind of jump into really curiosity and creativity.
Yeah, the intention of that class is, I think it's to really just open up of using tools and frameworks and things to help companies think differently about their customers. And it's applying a lot of things that have historically been used or kind of created and utilized by people that were in more specific creative roles. And I love this idea of, well, they're so powerful that what if we also applied them to kind of more the formal business or strategy or even marketing, where marketing has evolved today. And so it's just this idea of how do we become insanely obsessed with delivering exceptional experiences for our customers and surprising and delighting them, and how do you measure those things to make sure that you're hitting the business objectives and you want to do more of it or stop doing the stuff that's not working, and constantly keeping pace with the customers. And that, as I just think about where the different companies that I'm trying to lead, and those are the things that we really are making a difference on the growth of the business and the revenue. And so trying to help you guys, you entering to the workforce from college, of how you can go out and be leaders in organizations with these incredible skills and help them think differently about customer experiences.
I love that. And I think there's a lot of personal application to these things as well, not just in whatever business role we may have at different points in our careers, but also in our relationships and in other parts of our life, whether it's church service or community service or other things. I think there's just so much application with it.
Yeah, it's the last couple of years I've just really thought of, wow, like if I were to kind of pick one thing that I really want to just go deep on, and within my own work as well as my own kind of self-development and growth, it's around this idea of just like provocative growth. And not, it's business and in our personal lives. And so that's what I started challenging myself a couple of years ago, of what are the things that I find that really help me make some meaningful and intentional growth moments. And also, as I've worked and worked with teams and worked with students, like the stuff where I've seen the teams and students light up and stuff that's really connected well with them. And so that's where I've just really kind of been diving deep. And in this discovery, it's also just giving more clarity and kind of putting formal structure and words around some of the stuff that I've intuitively felt and experienced. But that's kind of led me to what we're going to talk on specifically on, like, curiosity, and why I think that it's like I think it's probably the greatest skill that we could develop. And it's the greatest skill that we do develop when we're born, but then we unlearn it and we stop using it. And it's kind of a paradox, because you leave college, and I guess the epiphany for me was I was graduating MBA school quite a while ago, and in all these interviews, these companies were saying, hey, we're looking for these people that can solve these interesting problems, and we have no idea, we haven't done this, that, or that before, and we've got to figure that out. And I thought, well, what you're wanting is like really interesting, creative problem solving and innovative thinking, but throughout all of our through formal schooling, that attribute, that skill was actually like beat out of you, and you were looked down on if you had it. Like you were you're sent to the island of misfits, and and so like it's such a paradox. Like everybody's claiming like the biggest thing they need help with is probably the biggest thing that skill that we minimize and in our formal education. So I guess it's been my own personal quest of, well, how do I help change that? And yeah, so that's kind of where I landed here.
I love that. And before diving deeper into curiosity, how would you define or kind of talk about curiosity? And then on top of that, why do you think we've seen a decline in curiosity? Like, why are you thinking that schools kind of maybe knocked that out of us?
The definition of curiosity, I've read a lot of different definitions, and some of them I'm like, I don't know, like that's kind of what it is. And even for myself, I'm still trying to come up with what really is, like, how do you best describe it? And because there are all these different interesting components about it, I think it's actually an innate, like it is wired innately in our cognitive brains. Like and I say that because it's something that is just innate of who we are and how, and when you look at little kids, their entire existence is based off of curiosity. Like their growth is dependent upon that. It is literally a life skill for them, because everything is completely new to them. And there's no inhibition. It's and there's no judgment. It's just, okay, this like, and that's what's so fascinating to me of how they can, children or even if you look at, the young animals, and it's crazy to see certain animals that like just learn so quickly from parents and what they can do. And so I think part of the definition, maybe we'll have to circle back when I finally like land on what is that right definition. But I think part of it is it's innate wiring of who we are, and it's also this lack of concern of what others might think, of judgment and bias. And it's also, if you think of it like just cognitively, it's before we really start to understand or get exposed to biases. And the more biases we're exposed to, the more that we see that those things actually impact our decisions and how we show up. And so I think the other part is just being able to look at things, in a very open and honest and unassuming perspective.
Yeah, it seems like to be truly curious, you need to put your guard down, kind of admit that you don't know everything and that you're willing to hear out new information and consider it. I also wonder too if there's a link between, you talked about curiosity and learning and stuff, and I wonder if there's a link between a student who's curious and then how well they remember material later on in life, and students who might just be going through the motions, not really being curious, but just doing what they're told. I'm sure there'd be some sort of connection there.
Absolutely. I mean, I can say from my own experience as a student, and also what I've seen with the students that come through my classes now, and even just the team members work on different team members that I've led, and who's curious and who's not. There's a direct correlation, and it's interesting because I see that there's like this greater divide right now of where people are just wanting to be told, where they're saying, hey, just tell me what you want me to regurgitate back to you, both in school as well as in the workplace.
I'm curious for the average person who wants to maybe practice curiosity again, because I think, like you said earlier, and we were talking about, like, as kids, we're super curious about everything, and kids tend to be pretty creative. We have wild imaginations and stuff. I remember one of the classes actually where we talked about curiosity. I think it was that class, but you showed a clip from Willy Wonka where he was singing about imagination, and it's definitely one of my favorite clips. But how do you think we can practice curiosity when we're so maybe out of touch with it, or if it's been so long since we've kind of touched into that side of ourselves?
I think the very first step is recognizing and appreciating that it can be fearful. It can be, there can be anxiety with it, because curiosity is allowing yourself to step into that area of things that you don't know. And we fear things that we don't understand or we don't know. And so I think the very first step is just recognizing and acknowledging yourself, like, yeah, this is going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. It's okay to feel that way. So when you recognize the fear, it's you're better able to kind of walk with it, and you don't have to keep feeding it, but you can acknowledge it, and it's a lot easier to then say, okay, it will be uncomfortable, but I'm going to give it a try. And so that's the first step. And then the next one is it's also just humility of recognizing that you're more focused and more interested in understanding what you can learn rather than being what's right. In fact, Johnny Ives, there was an article that he penned reflecting on the 10 years since Steve Jobs passed away and that incredible relationship that the two of them had. And he just, he shared some really, and I'm going to read some of those because I have these like on my phone as a constant reminder and, things that I constantly reflect back on. And, just a couple of things that really struck to me, stood out in his article. He said, talking about Steve, he said he was without doubt the most inquisitive human I have ever met. His insatiable curiosity was not limited or distracted by his knowledge or expertise, nor was it casual or passive. It was ferocious, energetic, and restless. His curiosity was practiced with intention and rigor. And then he says, our curiosity begs that we learn. And for Steve, wanting to learn was far more important than wanting to be right. And so I think that's so profound on, even how Steve Jobs, who was a brilliant guy, and, he built Apple, he built, he grew Pixar and helped that company scale. He kind of went back to Apple, pulled it out of complete bankruptcy, and built it into an incredible, insatiable, like, innovation machine. And the guy was super, super smart, but he never let his own knowledge or his ego or what he had learned in the past prevent him from constantly learning and being open to new ideas. And so I think that's the second part thing. So, recognizing and respecting the fear that goes with it, just being humble and open to learning. And then I think the third one is this idea, this desire for experimenting and being willing to say, hey, I've got this hypothesis, this wild and crazy idea. I'm going to run this little test and see what happens. And you know what? It might blow up, and or it might succeed. I actually think sometimes the things that blow up are the most valuable learning moments for us, because often we rarely look back when something works and it goes well. Do we actually go back and analyze, okay, what worked well and what would I do differently? Versus we get super, focused on trying to fix when the things that blow up, like, well, why did this fail? And so we just learn more out of that. But I think that, yeah, being cognizant of the fear, being humble and open to learning, and then just having this attitude of experimenting.
That's super cool. The quote that you read about Steve Jobs, it reminded me of, I was recently reading a book about Kobe Bryant and his life and kind of people's takes on Kobe Bryant, and something that apparently he did when he was transitioning away from his basketball career into his storytelling career before he passed away. Apparently he was just super, super curious. Like, he was calling writers and directors and just all people in that industry. He'd be calling them at 3 a.m. like super excited to learn more. And he had like his notebook out, and he would just ask tons of questions. And that also kind of ties in with the humility point too. You'd think that someone is successful as a Kobe Bryant or a Steve Jobs, that they would feel like they've done so much in their respective field that they don't need to hear from anyone else in any field. So it's cool that they can put those things aside and be willing to learn from others. And it also reminds me of, I heard someone, not to get into the religious aspect of it, but I did hear someone once say, like, they were telling an experience of how they were in this church class, and there was like this like 9-year-old girl speaking, and this person who was speaking, he'd been a member of this church for like 70 years, but he was just writing down notes like super, super fast. He was like willing to learn from someone who, and hear someone's perspective who had maybe a seventh of his experience. So I think it's cool to be able to kind of put your pride aside and to be able to learn from and ask questions from others, even if they might seem less experienced, because their perspectives are definitely valuable.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great example of that.
I'm also curious because we were talking about a little bit about curiosity and creativity. So just to ask pretty directly, like, how does being curious and practicing curiosity help us become more creative?
I think curiosity is the foundation of creativity, and then creativity is what feeds innovation. It all starts with that, and I kind of landed on this because I was years ago when I first read Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's DNA. It just launched, and they go in and they talk about like the 5 different kind of principles through all this research they did on these attributes that these incredible innovators that they all shared in common. And as I was going through that, I thought, well, I see that, yes, these are things are all there, but there's still something that is like overarching that. And even when I got exposed and started practicing the design thinking methodology, and around discovery and ideation and experimenting and scaling and launching and that as well. And the more I understood those things, I felt like there's something that's actually feeding you. Like the thing that's at the root of all of this is curiosity, because everybody here, all of those those different attributes from the amazing innovators, whether those things were like experimenting and observation and networking and stuff, and a lot of those things are also part of the design thinking methodology. But the root of those things is around curiosity. It's like you have this question of, well, what if? And so what if we tried this or that, or why not? And so I think, and that's where creativity really starts, because creativity is the concept of taking 2 different ideas and mashing them together to come up with something new. And or or reimagining what is already there. And that's fueled by by curiosity. Because it's the very moment you start asking questions, that's where curiosity, that's curiosity in action there.
It's interesting because I think those who are, you talked about the what if question. I know we did a practice in our class where when we were ideating, coming up with new ideas, you couldn't say anything subtractive, like you'd only add on to it, or like, what if this or what if that, and how about this? And I'm in this like performance psychology class right now, and the professor talks a lot about additive thoughts and subtractive thoughts. And I think in schools and in business and even in our relationships, we can sometimes receive a lot and also give a lot of subtractive thoughts, like, oh, like that couldn't work because of this, or you couldn't run half marathon because you're blown out knee or something like that. Like there's so many subtractive thoughts, but true curiosity and like when you're really in the creative mode, it's because of those kind of additive thoughts where you're jumping in and you're saying, like, you might not know exactly how to get to the end goal that you're working on, but you kind of ask those, or you say those what if questions, or what if this, and how about we try this? So I think it's much more positive to be super curious and to be adding on to people's kind of imaginations than tearing down and trying to be like I think people describe it as a realist. I don't think you need to be delusional or anything to be creative, but it's just interesting how society is kind of like that.
Yeah. Well, and even so, that article I mentioned earlier about that Johnny Ives wrote, in there he also describes that he and Steve would spend most days they'd spend at lunch together, and they would just sit there and talk about ideas. And Steve would come in there. Johnny describes it that Steve would come in there and share these different ideas, and he says like many of them were dopey ideas, like terrible, but they never discounted them, and that's because in the midst of even those dopey ideas, that's where the gems would come. And it's because sometimes you've got to get the dopey ideas out of the way, and you've got to go through that before you can open up, or you start kind of stumbling and discovering. Sometimes dopey ideas lead to the great ideas. And there's a whole nother, like, maybe that's another podcast or conversation around ideas and idea flow. Because it's and Jeremy Utley's just released a book called Idea Flow. He teaches over at Stanford's D School. Really, really brilliant guy. And he did a lot of research that shows like the best ideas, the greatest determinant of getting great ideas comes through the volume of ideas. Doesn't matter how the quality, but if you just have more ideas, then you're going to have better ideas. And so that's where I think curiosity and that willingness to say and to consider all ideas, because there might be like part of an idea might be really valuable. You don't have to throw the whole thing out and discount the whole thing. And plus, sometimes in the discussion and the evaluation, that okay, that one's just really not going to work. But what if we took that and we tried this?
Yeah, well, that actually, what you said about the Idea Flow book reminds me of something. I was re-listening to Atomic Habits recently, and there was a story that James Clear talked about with this photography class, and the teacher kind of split the class in two, and for half the class, their assignment was to focus on quality. So by the end of the semester, they were graded purely on just one picture they took, but it had to be great and everything. And then the other half was totally graded off quantity, how many pictures they could take. And it turned out that the best quality pictures were the people who took the most pictures, because they had the most practice, and they probably had some really, really bad pictures along the way throughout the semester. But I think, yeah, sometimes the best ideas, and a lot of the time, actually, the best ideas come after lots and lots of failure. And I think we all kind of want to pull a gem out of the dirt and just go one for one and come up with a brilliant idea. But I think a lot of people, there's a big hesitation to all the failure that comes along the way, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as you choose to learn from it.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a really powerful example of their story. I always struggled when I had managers that would say, things like, I only want to hear the best idea. Only bring me the single best idea that's going to solve this problem for us. And I think that's the wrong way to lead, or the wrong way to inspire, to drive teams on trying to solve problems. And so one of the things that I like to do with my teams is often we throw out kind of the first idea, or maybe the second one, but like that's what we offer. We think, okay, that's the solution. But usually the really good ideas, they're like further down the list. And so I actually will challenge my teams of like, if we're trying to solve something, all right, let's get all the ideas out, and we'll kind of get kind of the surface level ones, and it's like, okay, now you still got it, so bring me 5 more. And let's explore 5 more ones. And so, because everybody usually stops after the first or second idea. And if you go to that exercise of going deeper and looking for additional ones, that's usually where you find the better ones. And I also think that it's like, the other thing with that is everybody is an idea, and everybody has the ability to be curious. It's not just, when we talk about these things on curiosity, creativity, and innovation, I think some people tend to reserve it for those who are in the creative field or those who work on the design team, when really every employee at a company should be an innovator, can be an innovator, and should contribute to the ideas.
No, I think that's awesome that, yeah, everyone should be an innovator in their companies and in their own lives. And I do want to bring up something that we talked a decent amount in class about. And I think a lot of people, when they're trying to come up with ideas or look at things differently, they'll view constraints as reasons why they can't do something. And I know that we've talked a lot about how constraints often can foster creativity if viewed right. And as far as coming up with ideas, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know who this quote gets attributed to, but it's the saying is, creativity loves constraints. And there's been some really cool research and on these some experiments that have been run where if you and I've run this similar, because I'm like, well, I'd like to replicate that. The idea, if you give a group of people a blank canvas and tell them to create, like, it's totally blank. You can come up with, create the best painting of whatever you want. versus you give another group and you define certain criteria or constraints that they have to paint within. And the ones who actually end up producing the better stuff and actually even produces it on time are the ones that have the constraints. And it's because I think where creativity is it's looking for jumping off points, and it's looking for things that you need to say, like, okay, these are the parameters and this is what I have. What if I remix these things, or where can I start? And so that's why constraints are really powerful. I mean, you look at what COVID did, and the number of companies that were still incredibly slow to adopting digital transformations and different digital practices, and customer experiences were really lacking. And suddenly, COVID comes in and the world goes, shut down, and companies scramble, and they literally make these changes and build things out that they had slated for multi-years of development and implementation. They were rolling these things out in a matter of months, and that was because the team, that the constraints that came with that, it allowed the teams to get super hyper focused on solving that problem, and then jumping off points of like, well, we can already cross these things out, like these aren't even options. So you now just eliminated a whole bunch of stuff you're not going to spend time on. And so you can now be more focused on where you can spend the time of exploring and experimenting.
That's interesting. And I think it seems that those who are best able to embrace change, whether it's a business or whether it's an individual, would be those who are most curious and most open-minded. And I think it's those of us who could be closed-minded, or who might kind of want to stick with the status quo, that change is really, really hard for those people who don't really want to be curious, and stuff as well. So it's interesting that those companies could adapt so quick because they were curious about ways that they could adapt to a new situation that, even though it wasn't ideal, and it still wasn't ideal, they're able to adapt pretty well. A lot of those companies, at least.
Yeah. And I think, I guess to kind of bring it home, we talked a lot about, kind of companies in the business world, but if you want to succeed in driving this in the business world, it starts with just, with ourselves and our, working on this individually. And, the notion of like work-life balance, to me, I don't think I think that's kind of bollocks, in that work and life are intertwined and you can't separate them out. You can't go on vacation, and at least not for myself. Like sometimes it's like you get this idea, something comes out of your head about a business problem, and you can't just like say, no, I'm going to reject that. And like, you can acknowledge it, write it down, and then spend time on going deeper with it after your vacation. But, there's it's flow. And so that's why I'm a huge believer that if you work on these things at a personal level, they're going to help you in any other setting that you're in. And so even like I try and practice curiosity and being open to stuff, yet I still catch myself. I have an amazing partner and wife who she's so patient with me, and like the things that she is a saint, and and being patient with me, and sometimes when she'll share something or a suggestion, and I might have already kind of had experience with that, and I'll catch myself like not giving a second thought to it, and that's wrong. Or she'll bring like an opposing opinion or perspective on something than what I had, and so I think it's important even there. I constantly remind myself, okay, wait a minute, what is it? I would like to understand what's perspective or what context does she have on this, and usually, it's very enlightening to kind of go through that exercise, and you don't always have to like change. You're not always going to change what your initial thought was, but often you do, or you have an expanded view of it because you've gone through that exercise of considering, and so I think it's just something that we constantly should be working and massaging on a daily basis. And as you do that, that's going to show up in your work, kind of your work side as well.
Definitely. Kind of as we're wrapping up, just one last topic that ties in with curiosity is the importance of asking questions. I think, and this directly ties into kind of our school experience and even work experience. A lot of people are scared to ask questions at work. They're scared to ask questions at school, and in the fear of kind of maybe appearing like they don't know so much, or that they, or for any reason. So how do we know what questions to ask, and how can we also kind of put the fear away of like, I know people will say there's no dumb questions. Like, how can we kind of develop that attitude of like just asking questions, and how to do that tactfully maybe?
Yeah, I think it's important for people who are leading, or leading others and managing, that they create that. It's their responsibility to help create that safe space for that. So that's part of it, but we can't just throw, because inevitably you're going to work with someone, you'll be in a group of people where you might not, that kind of safe space or culture hasn't been firmly established, and so that shouldn't be an excuse for you. So, so I think it's kind of two parts. As we're all looking, and we have influence with others, and so like that's something for us to consider. Like, am I communicating and sending signals that, hey, this is a safe space for questioning? But then looking introspectively of how can we, to your question, what can we do to overcome the fear of asking questions? I'd start with just like I start by collecting questions. And I have, my Evernote, I have a tab in there that's broken down into different categories of questions. And whether it's questions I have, or questions that I've read or heard other people ask and thought, man, that was a really cool question. There's an amazing book called The Beautiful Question. And that's awesome for, helping kind of explore different ways to ask questions in different areas and things. But I think it's just starting with the people that you trust, and where you feel that you can be vulnerable, and just starting that practice of, okay, I can ask questions here in this space, and getting comfortable with that. And then kind of working, okay, can I expand this? Is there another group that I feel like I can, I might not have as much of a comfort level, but I'm gonna tamper my fear and anxiety. I'm gonna and be willing to be vulnerable a bit and ask a question in that space. And so that, I think that's a great way of kind of working into it, into kind of feeling more comfort and gaining more confidence with it.
No, I love that. And I think you're right with, especially just the art of practicing, asking questions, practicing curiosity, like it, because the more you do it, the more confidence you have with it to do it in other bigger and more important settings even. But I think with that practice, it's important to acknowledge too, like there might be times where you ask something, or you raise your hand in a class and you say something, and it doesn't come off the tip of your tongue like you wanted it to, and it kind of makes you sound a little bit dumb. But it's important that to recognize like you're just practicing the art of being curious, asking good questions, and along the way you might kind of stumble with your words a little bit, and that's not a bad thing. And kind of tying this back to how we started, you were talking about the art of unlearning some things, relearning. I know Adam Grant wrote a book called Think Again, which dives deep into kind of the practice of unlearning and relearning things. And it seems like we all have to kind of intentionally unlearn this idea that curiosity and asking questions is a bad thing, and relearn just how we can do that in our lives, which is just, it's definitely a hard process, but we have to be intentional with it, and it can yield really awesome results.
Absolutely. And I think, start with like, it can come across in so many different ways, if I think that the other easy way, or kind of to help start developing this, is just like, what's something that you're interested in that you don't have a deep knowledge about. You're like, hey, I've always wondered about that. Well, go spend some time learning about it, because that right there is a curious moment, and go and uncover new things, and what you start to, you then get this feeling of, oh my goodness, this is really interesting, or you know what, I had this question and I'm satisfied that, and I don't want to know any more about it, and that's okay as well. But I think there's no limit. It doesn't have to necessarily be like work things that we're curious about. It's just this idea of, it's a practice. And I think it's a practice that everybody should should just get really comfortable. Like I said, it's the way that we, this is our life, every day of our waking hours, when we were young. Like that's how we grew. That's how we entered this world, was through this like wild, insatiable, little curious beings. And so it's just going back to that, what is it's inherently in us. And so you just gotta get through all the clutter and the scar tissues of the years and go back to what that, that childlike curiosity and wonder is.
Definitely. And it's a much more fun way to live, being super curious and always in this learning mindset. That's way more fun, in my opinion, than just kind of being stuck in a routine. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your thoughts. And yeah, any last thoughts or anything else that you wanted to share?
No, I mean, I guess if I were to close out, just one final thought, Rick Rubin, he, in his book, The Creative Act, he says the artist is the one who recaptures that childlike fascination with the world. And I think that's a really powerful reminder. And so I challenge myself every day, and just, I'd like to challenge anyone who's listening to this, of try that tomorrow. When you wake up, how can you just ask yourself, okay, what am I going to express that kind of childlike fascination about today? And then, before you go to bed, hold yourself accountable to it, and do a little review, like, okay, what was I really fascinated about today and curious. And I think that's that's an easy place for all of us to start.
It's a great suggestion. I'll have to try that. Ben, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Dallas.